Welcome back to Great Karate Myths. Today we're diving deep into the fascinating transformation of karate, from its perceived classical roots to the dynamic styles practiced today. We'll explore karate's hidden history, from its functional roots to the classical styles it emerged later, and ultimately how it transformed into the modern sport we know today. So if you're curious about the true story behind karate's evolution, then tighten your yuwagi and get ready to learn. Welcome, gents. Let's get straight in. Tom, would you like to kick off this discussion by defining what we mean by classical and modern karate?
From a kata perspective, there's no such thing as classical karate. There's, what we've talked about already. There's forms, katas, which were manuals. So that's not classical karate, but that became the source material for what later developed into modern karate, really. It's really when there's sort of two distinct periods. There's when kata was central to it, and then when sparring became central. That's one way of looking at it. And lots of ideas were built up around kata practice that may not necessarily be true because they didn't have the functions of the forms. So we can break that down. So this idea that you'd learn, 3 years for one kata. Why? What's that about? Gichi Funakoshi pointed out that experts would have only typically known 3 to 5 kata back in the day. Why is that true? And so there's these different ideas that are built up around the forms. And these ideas were central to the practices of the time. So you went to your teachers, you practiced the kata over and over again. They gave you a nod whether it was any good, and then you just do it again and again and again. There's not a lot of descriptions from the early pioneers of being taught bunkai, applications of forms, or Funakoshi's own recollections of learning teki. He doesn't describe that he in any way spent any time grappling with a tosu or being taught why the fist shape, which we know and talked about many times, why it was that. It was simply lots and lots of repetition, and that was how you mastered karate. Then as karate spreads into Japan, at the influence of other martial arts and the drive to expand karate and establish it, sparring's introduced, and kata eventually starts to take a bit of a back seat, and it's there and it takes on a new life later on in the creative interpretation. But sparring is what drives and moves it all forward, really, and what spreads it to become a global phenomenon. Yeah. Nathan, I don't know if you want to jump in there.
One of the drivers of the creation of modern karate was the fairly conscious attempt to make karate conform to existing ideas of Kendo, which was the modern form of Japanese swordsmanship, in which practice was conducted with split bamboo imitation swords referred to as shinai. And of course, Kendo was primarily a sport, with an emphasis on competition. Early founders of karate decided to take, or early founders of styles, probably I should say, decided to take, or some of them, to take karate in that direction. Although, curiously, two of the biggest names, if you like, influences, that's a better word, on karate are so notably Funakoshi Jichin, founder of the Shotokan style, and of course Miyagi Chojun, founder of the Goju-ryu style, weren't directly, in fact, Funakoshi Jichin disliked competitive karate, and it didn't even care much for sparring, or free sparring rather, and taught instead fixed sparring. Miyagi Chojun himself, the founder of Goju-ryu, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that he was in any way an enthusiast of sports karate, or even particularly keen on free sparring. That all came later. In fact, the whole idea of karate is relatively recent. So, we're looking at something that didn't really begin its formation or serious form, leaving aside the antiquity of some of the kata. We're looking at something. Well, it was underway certainly in the 1920s, but it really didn't get going until post World War II. So to keep to the point, most karate could be considered as modern, as a practice, as a club activity. Most of it is indeed pretty, or more accurately, I suppose I could say postmodern. But it's has this. I think Robert W. Smith, American author on largely Chinese martial arts, described something along similar lines when referring to. He was actually talking about a Chinese style bagua, but he referred to it having the pleasant flavour of antiquity, which is really what how karate seems to present. But pretty much, it's modern. What is not modern? We can look at what we've referred to as previously as antique kata, and that would be kata like the Sanchin that we've discussed considerably already, and perhaps the Naihanchin look to be very early. They look to be late Ming, early Qing dynasty. So to give some context, they're certainly 17th century or appear to be 17th century, but they arrived from China, or rather they came up through Okinawa, and as Tom has already pointed out, they didn't come with any applications, often termed bunkai. So the forms, it was assumed that repeated practice of the forms would confer mastery, with no attention to what the forms actually did. Now, that's not my opinion. The lack or the paucity of applications is often described as karate was secret, or so that there were no written records, or that the early karate masters were illiterate peasants. Well, that's not accurate at all. Funakoshi Jichin Sensei was himself a Confucian scholar and a schoolmaster. And yes, undoubtedly there were uneducated practitioners, but a lot of the practitioners that are actually on record were indeed well educated and well educated. I could give several examples, but I think the point's already made. So the kata themselves are the original. It's difficult. We won't go there now to classify the kata, but the antique, as we've termed them, antique kata, like the Sanchin and the Naihanchin, are as I've already said, from the 17th century, and yet, as Tom's pointed out, they weren't organized into ryuha styles or family schools. They were one did the kata. They weren't styles, and in fact, Funakoshi Jichin did not like the idea of naming. He didn't name his school Shotokan. That was done by his students, in the same way that Miyagi Chojun did not designate his school as Goju-ryu. In fact, that came about when he'd sent Juhatsu Kyoda as a representative to mainland Japan for a demonstration. He gave a demonstration, and at that time, actually, historically, our research indicates he may well have only known 3 kata. That would be Sanchin, Seisan, and I believe Tensho, as they call it. But he gave a demonstration nonetheless, and he was asked to the name of his school, and he didn't actually have one, so he concocted one. He referred to what he was demonstrating as Hankyo Ryu, half hard and half soft. When he went back to Okinawa and reported back to Miyagi Chojun, then Miyagi consulted a well-known manual, the Bubishi, and chose to determine to describe his school as a Go-Ju-Ryu, which is half hard, half soft, hard soft, which is basically the same as Hankyo-Ryu, but he designated it as Goju-Ryu. So even the styles didn't get their names until late, and from that point on, they became styles, recognizable styles, but they never were. I think I've got to take, well, I'm not wearing a hat, but metaphorically take my hat off to a long conversation I had with Tom, one of many splendid conversations over the last few years. But when Tom, I'm sorry, I don't want to steal your thunder, Tom, but Tom was speaking about the Okinawan Palace, the connection that it has with some of the karate quotes masters, and there seems to be a connection with the royal shuri, which is one of the main cities, well, the capital city indeed, Okinawa. And I think Tom was postulating that we were discussing the idea that which had been reflected actually in the work of Mark Bishop of the term palace hand. And some karate had been obliquely referred to as palace hand. And looking at this, and I again take off my metaphoric hat to Tom on the well, I'll leave it to Tom to discuss if that's okay about the bow. I don't want to steal your thunder, but there's a great indicator of what these kata. It's not that there are many kata extant, and some of them are old, date from the times that I've already mentioned. But a lot of them were associated, not the Sanchin, the Seisan, and the Sanseiru, but the other group of kata from the so-called Shuri school rather than the Naha school, which are associated with the royal Shuri palace and the guards, and we can see why. And it's not that they would learn a significant number of these kata, as a collect. You have to learn, 15 or more kata. A modern day Shotokan has over 27. Goju-ryu has 12 typically. It's not that the guards would have to learn them all. I think it depended on their station, because different kata were for using different tools, as Tom's indicated. Some were for the Zai, which is actually particularly the Naha tradition, but some were for the Tonfa, and some, Tom's excellent work on disarming a bow staff, the long 6 foot plus staff, or retaining possession of one when it's trying to be removed from you. It seems to be reflected in some of these kata. So it's not that somebody would learn, okay, you now have to learn all of these kata. Depends on your job. And we can look at this in modern policing, in which you might, in London, in England, you would see, there are mounted police who ride horses. There are police who are dog handlers who handle dogs. There are regional squad cars. There are traffic, police. There are many sort of different divisions that require different skill sets. Why should it be any different for the Okinawan palace? Why should it be, or for policing in general? Originally in China and later in Okinawa. Just to round that up, by the time it gets to Japan as karate, all of that is out of the picture. And what's inherited ultimately are a set of physical movements that look, to all intents and purposes, like some exotic unarmed combat. And, a question I asked, that will be 35 years ago now, was how come we don't find such an approach in other countries? We don't find it in Europe particularly, or on the African continent. We don't find that approach to unarmed fighting. And it's quite interesting that pretty much every culture and society has wrestling, but the idea of boxing, it's just assumed that there's always the potential for a combative, ballistic punch kick fighting art that can be contained in forms, or certainly was in Okinawa, if not in China. That's peculiar to Chinese thinking and to Oriental thinking. It's steeped in mystery and but actually all over the world there's wrestling, but not particularly these percussive ballistic arts. And yet, what people have done, karate enthusiasts and early scholars of modern karate, have tried to say, well, yes, there always has been some form of ballistic fight. Pankration, I don't know if I pronounce it very well. I've only ever really read it, although some sort of Greco-Roman or Greek form of boxing with spiked gloves. But common sense dictates that anyone, if ever they did practice such a thing, other than perhaps gladiators, it wouldn't last long. You couldn't. How would you survive the training? Evidence is scant. I'm not saying there is none. I'm saying it's scant. So the actual wrestling is endemic. Every culture, or most cultures. I'm sure someone can find a culture that doesn't have wrestling. Boxing is not. This is often confused. Karate and boxing, free sparring, jumbled up. And actually, if you really look at boxing, and we're not doing boxing history at this point, but we're looking at the Marquis of Queensberry type of boxing with the rules and the stances and the ring and the rounds, which didn't exist before. That itself is fairly recent, and as arose with the Marquis of Queensberry, and some of the postures were certainly pre-fighting postures were adopted by notable karate teachers.
So if the usefulness of kata can be successfully divorced from the dynamic modern sport of karate, why do we think it was put together in the first place?
So just going back to talking about the palace hand and bodyguarding or palace guards, it's really another one of those kind of contexts or territories where specific martial skills were formalized into forms, and it can offer perhaps one of a few reasons why kata were put together in the first place. These physical manuals. It's very, very easy to then, if you've got a method of how a palace should be guarded, or training bodyguards or palace guards or police or whatever, you can then send someone who's an expert in those forms out to a satellite province or an outpost or something, and they can then train people in the form very, very quickly. It doesn't require the ability to read. It's not easy to read Chinese. Not everyone would have been educated to the level to be able to read and interpret a written manual at that time. But a physical form, a physical manual, is something that's can be quite quickly learned. And so it's very interesting that forms like Kusanku, Pasai, and Goju Shiho, amongst others, found their way into people working in the Okinawan royal court. And this has been written about a lot and is well recorded elsewhere, that the Okinawan royal court was a kind of a satellite of China. And they paid tribute to the Chinese emperors and so on. And it's in the forms that they had and practiced there, like Kusanku, were in fact manuals for palace guards and their tools and the skills they needed to bodyguard and protect the palace. And so they've inherited those forms, which is really it's either really lucky or it's not coincidence. It's hard to say, really, because those forms don't exist in China anymore. But what you've got are forms that are well suited to the context of protecting the king, protecting the palace, and working with the layout of the palace as well, which you see in some of the techniques of the weaponry, that the environment is well considered as well. So that's another element in the antique forms, the forms inherited from China, is that in the original function, the environment would have been given a consideration as well. So, if you're fighting on a battlefield, you might be in a wide open space. It's not jungle warfare. But if you're looking after a palace or you're policing in the streets, you might be in quite an enclosed environment and need to be able to operate the tools and the skills within quite a small space, or not. So that's another area that's useful when exploring these original functions. Again, not just a street fight where space is unlimited, the ground's lovely and even, you're not going to slip over. Flat concrete is usually what's assumed. If you start factoring in a staircase, for example, like you would in a palace, or a narrow passageway, or, uneven ground, slippery ground, all that kind of stuff. It changes the way that you would move. And so the footwork and the stances and the postures are from considerations of what environment you're going to be operating in as well. So there's that palace hand represents another context alongside perhaps something like civil policing, which is what the sai would have been used for. And the value in having a physical manual means it's easily transported outwards, and other people can be trained without requiring high levels of literacy or needing to interpret from a book. You can be shown the form, how to train, how to develop your skills, and left to get on with it. That kind of also brings up what we talked about earlier is 3 years, 1 kata necessary? And the answer is no. That's something that's been added on later on. With something like the Weichi Sanchin and the use of the sai, you should be pretty competent in about 6 weeks and pretty good after around 6 months, ready to take on the kind of expansion and some techniques for in the Seisan and or the Sanseiru. And you wouldn't need a great deal because it's very, very specific what the function is. So somebody can be trained up in a few months and they can be out using and applying the skills. If you had to train with the sai for 3 years just in the Sanchin before you were even good enough to step up into the Seisan, it's not a practical means to train someone. You need to be good quickly. You find within the Sanchin and these other forms the means to really cut through to what's important quite quickly and get that off quite quickly. Once your grips are good, once your dexterity is good, then you can start working on some of these techniques in the Seisan and going out and getting that all important experience in applying them. And just to finish off on that point about contexts, we've talked about civil policing and perhaps guarding a palace or bodyguarding. Another context that can be considered is theatrical as well. So some form-based martial arts have clearly inherited forms or routines perhaps for the stage that are clearly not combatively effective, armed or unarmed, and use the body in a way that just wouldn't be practical for palace guarding. And they also wouldn't be very good in a street fight or an MMA fight or anything like that. So examples, something like monkey boxing, something like that. Paulie Zink comes to mind, the American martial arts instructor, used to do these incredible forms, monkey staff, and very, very gymnastic and acrobatic. And they're kind of what's survived from opera, Chinese opera. And so that's another context to consider when researching these forms. So it's not just we've never just assumed that these were going to be practical, combative skills with some kind of military or civil context. It could be theatre. But what you don't ever find is that it's street fighting.
Beautifully made point. A number of points that are deeply interconnected. I think that it's good to introduce. I've said in the past, and we've agreed that there was the idea of self-defense. There was the aesthetics, the art, an idea of having an art of karate or a do, which we'll discuss not in this, but on another occasion. But also the idea of self-defense. When I was young, so let me think now. Well, this is not a boast. It's just a quick reflection. I've got 50 years' experience. Good grief, it's flown by, and I've loved karate, mine as long as I can remember. But I can remember being told, and I wrote about this in a number of publications and books. How long does it take to master the art of karate? typically something I was told as a years takes years, 20 years. And I've written and I've said, imagine if you decided to take up tennis, and so you go to a tennis club and you speak with the coach, and you say, well, I want to play tennis. How long is it going to take me to get to become 20 years? Really, would people accept that? No. Does it take 20 years? That's not to decry the experienced professional. You can take, I don't know, Tiger Woods springs to mind with golf. No one can say he's still good. So someone can be pursuing something, for 20 plus years, and still have a degree of skill and competency. But it doesn't mean that it takes 20 years, nor should it take 20 years to. And I'll just refer to something Tom said, and we've agreed on this in the past. If you look at any basic training in armed services, in policing, particularly not in agreement with conscription, by the way, but in conscription, 6 weeks, you get your 6 you get your 6 weeks training, and that's it. And then you do the rest on the job. You couldn't imagine saying, well, we're going to train police officers, but it'll take, we've got to plan ahead here, because they're not going to be any good for 20 years, or even 3 years. And I agree with Tom's view that 6 weeks and then 6 months, and it's only not only, but karate is typical of something that where I've been guilty of this. So I'll talk about, rather than put this burden on others, in the past, not of saying this will take years, talking to students and instructing students. When I as an instructor in those early days of instructing, that would be in the early 80s, didn't know what the forms did myself. I'd known only what I'd been told, and what I tried to make up myself. This is a position that lots of coaches and teachers, martial art teachers, were in, have always been in fact. The reason it takes 20 years or longer, and some people never get an understanding, because if you don't, no disrespect to any individuals, that's why I'm not using names except my own, except me, I'm referring to myself. If you don't know what the forms are for, then you're going to spend years wandering around these forms. I think it was Miyagi Chojin that said, well, I don't think I know. It was recorded by Morio Higona sensei, a very senior Goju-ryu a teacher of considerable prominence, who was quoting Miyagi Chojin sensei, founder of Goju-ryu karate, who said, he was feeling disconsolate and wrote it. He said, here I am after all these years, still wandering around in the dark. And that, to me, whilst it's not explicit, it's a tacit statement that he still didn't really know what the function of a kata were, which I think led him to be very creative in the way that he was. That's obviously another subject that we'll get into. But on topic, the difference between the classical or the antique, the old karate, and the modern karate, just to summarize before handing back over, is that back in the day, as Tom put it earlier, there was just the kata, and as Nagamine Shoshin wrote, and others have reflected on, a great Shorin-ryu or Shurite teacher, one learned kata from one sensei. One didn't expect to learn self-defense or fighting from one sensei, and that actually was the view generally taken. So the old way of training was kata. That was it. Kata. That then developed into let's have a set of basics. So repetitive, marching up and down with punching and blocking and kicking and so on. Incidentally, on kicking, they don't really occur in the antique kata in any significant way. Certainly not in the way that they're used today. But there was only the kata. What then happened is, through transition, kata acquired a set of basics which were particularly suitable for teaching children. And then, of course, the sparring. And as I've commented before, that produced three types of training, which not really appear to be related, but they're not. And the modern karate contains all of those elements, whereas the traditional karate consisted just pretty much primarily of of practicing kata. Not to say there weren't attempts, and there's certainly photographic evidence to show early founders applying what appeared to be kata movements, but nothing that was systematic or logical, progressive, or actually particularly functional. Just before handing over, one of the biggest problems that faced those early teachers is the same problem that faces people today who are trying to use traditional kata in a freestyle situation. Is you can't, because you don't know what the opponent's doing, where their punch or kick is going, which height it's at. So the general response is to get yourself out of the way and slap away whatever comes reflexively. And all those magnificent kata and all those intricate, magnificent movements just it's becoming impossible to apply in a freestyle situation because the context is completely wrong.
I think that highlights a point as well, that what we're talking about in terms of the original functions isn't weapons used in a dueling context, a toing and throwing. It's a pair of sai sparring a bow or dueling a bow or anything like that. What's a common thread that exists in the antique forms is that they're really about going first, preemption. And there's not the reason that sparring didn't evolve with these old forms and things like that when they were put together is because you can't spar with them. It's not a reciprocal, it's not an exchange, it's not a match, it's not a duel. But the idea of a duel has become very, very ingrained in the kind of perception of karate, that you square off against everything from start to finish is about a one-on-one. It's very and that is a modern development, and that's an outside idea that didn't exist in the original functions of the forms. So using that Sanchin as an example again, and that the methodology of using a pair of sai, it's not as you would see in modern Kabudo, where they've taken that idea of dueling and put it back into weapons exchanges, where someone with a bow or a bokken squares off against someone with some sai, and there's a block and a counter and an exchange. It's not that at all. The person with the sai will be intending to go first, to restrain, pin, trap, press, and overwhelm. And that's what you see in these forms. The techniques are not lingering on a gap. It's closing the space down as quickly as possible to apply the tool with the intention of going first, overwhelming them, being in charge of the situation. I know that's not always going to be successful or the case, but that's the general intention. And so sparring methods don't really bring anything of value to these older martial skills that we see in the palace hand or the civil methods of, for example, using the sai or restraining and things like that. And that's a clear difference between the classical methods and modern karate. And approaching kata, we can't approach antique forms from the mindset of a duel, of sparring, or a scenario, because it's not scenarios. They're kind of methods and maps of how to navigate the territory and overwhelm within that territory. As soon as someone drew some sai, say, for example, you've got a pair of sai and someone's in front of you with a knife, if you haven't followed the method that's been taught, or the education you received in your forms, and you go, right, well, we're going to duel this out, it's anyone's game then. You're right back in that dueling territory. And that's exactly where you want to, what you would want to avoid in trying to use these skills efficiently. And so sometimes it's hard to kind of wrap your head around the mindset, because I know from my own experience coming from Wadaroo, it's very much dueling, that mindset, the starting distance, the set distance, the bunkai takes place quite formally. This is what it does at this. That's so far removed. That is a modern imprint based on these antique forms.
One of the a key significator for this, a person who really influenced this, although not himself agreeing with free sparring, the founder of Shotokan, Funakoshi Jichin Sensei, he used the term karate ni senti nashi. That translates, I mean, it's normally said there's no first attack, but senti nashi, there's no first hand. There is no, in other words, you don't go attack first, which is precisely the opposite of what's actually required. Now, I'm not contradicting Funakoshi Sensei, because you'll discover, later in with us the deep respect we have for him and his creation of what we perceive as the art of karate do, or the way of karate, rather than as loosely been interpreted in the past, karate jutsu, or the technique, which is, I don't find that particularly useful, but it can work. There is no first strike. Basically postulates or posits that the karate is therefore primarily defensive, so there should always be uke, or crudely translated as a block, otherwise termed as a way of receiving a force or an attack. That should be first, and then the counter. And it's been said quite correctly that all of the in fact not correctly, that all of the kata are structured that way. Well, as we've been referencing all along, or Tom's just put in really into context, you need to go first. It's proactive and preemptive. It's not reactive and defensive, and that's its edge. And that will be true. Let's just hop over from Naihanchin to another key kata from the sister or brother style of karate, Shuri or Shorin-ryu, away from the Naha, and look at the Naihanchin. Guess what? Same principle. The operator needs to go first to get the adversary under control immediately, and it's particularly in a very specific way. It's control, and then total control of those limbs before they can do any harm. It's a preventative measure. The reality, that's it, is that you cannot use the techniques from the kata once an opponent or adversary is flailing away at you. You can't then suddenly go into kata mode and your fists coming all over the place from every angle, and somehow you're supposed to miraculously respond. That's not at all how it was structured. And so Tom's quite right. It's preemptive. The operative goes first.
I'm just going to add something to that as well. If people want to have a quick look at a couple of the segments of the Naihanchin grappling, they can see that on the YouTube channel as well. We've got a couple of clips of some of the grappling catalogue of Naihanchin. The point you made, where if someone ends up flailing or fighting, you're really going for it, it's not going to work. By the time you've reached that point, that skill set is no longer valid. The obvious question is, well, how would that have been dealt with? And it's dealt with by that you wouldn't have been on your own. So in a civil policing or bodyguarding, you're not the only palace guard, or you're not the only civil police officer or whatever. You're working in teams. And that is also something that is, in my opinion, considered in the context, the territories for these different martial skill sets. So in karate, there's modern karate. The modern perspective is, how do you take on multiple opponents? The classical perspective in the antique forms is, how do we work together to take down one? And so the exact reverse again, when you have two people that are trained in the same method, the same methodology, if you've got two people armed with a pair of sai, your chance of success, especially if you're both going first, is going to be huge. And where one person may be failing, the other person is then stepping in and attempting to overwhelm from the others. So it's obvious, and it's all the problems that modern karate has in dealing with multiple opponents are the very reasons why those antique forms were so successful, because you would be working in a partnership or a team. You'd be a team of bodyguards, you'd be a team of police officers. So that's an important factor. And one of the criticisms that we've had before about the Naihanchin is people look at the grappling, the sequence, the catalogue, and they say, well, that would never work. Well, one-on-one, when you're looking at that catalog, yeah, you could argue that. But if you've got two people grabbing someone's limbs to restrain, over that kind of really overwhelming, both knowing how each other's operating, like police officers do now. If one person tries to arrest a person, it's very, very difficult. But if you've got two or three, I know it's still difficult, your chances of getting that person restrained and cuffed, are far, far better. And you still see wrist locks and pain compliance and restraining via the arms and hands used today. Maneuvers are still there, teams working together to then restrain someone and get them cuffed. And so you can see historically how that Naihanchin grappling method, again, look at the YouTube channel for some snippets of it, when applied with two people onto one, working together and so on, could have been potentially very, very effective.
Well, yep. Without doing sort of back history, I'm an old warrior or an old soldier. I was an army cadet, but I was never in the army. But I was a police cadet. I was paid and at college at the same time through the scheme. And I remember going out, observing the first arrest. That was quite. I agree with you totally. It were 5 officers and one sort of observing uniformed police cadet, watching with jaw on the ground. It took 5 officers. It was a very violent man, very large and violent man, and it took 5 officers. But they just go by sheer weight and got him to the ground, and exactly as you described. Controlled the limbs and pain compliance. The person gives up. Obviously, I think there was a curious term that was introduced to me some 30 odd years ago. I don't think it's used anymore, but if someone's charlied up, quote unquote, which basically referred to somebody on drugs of some sort, probably amphetamines or something, that would make them, particularly difficult to apprehend or detain. But this is stuff that goes on every day in every country in policing, in police work, which is, I think, essentially what we're talking about. So if we're looking at traditional, there was no traditional karate. There was just the kata. There were no styles, and as we've already discussed, those styles were in 2 broad divisions: the sort of Naha, the Goju-ryu type, and the Weichi-ryu, and the Shorin-ryu, the Shotokan type of karate with the longer stances, different functions. And I think, I don't know if I'm stealing your thunder again, Tom, but the palace hand, we've had that discussion. The palace hand seems to be the Shorin-ryu kata. I'm not ruling out the Naha kata being used for that, but I think that the Sai are a different kind of policing. I'm not saying that they weren't used in the past, but we don't seem to have much evidence for that. They seem to have been much more in society, but we can't be sure because the Chinese origins are somewhat obscured. But we can be sure that the Sai as a tool or a weapon definitely comes from China. It's not something that originates in Okinawa or Japan, and they are as we they are policing tools. So the modern karate has nothing to do with that, and it has this. I'm going to say obsessive because it is. Most of us that practiced I'm not from the earliest period of the introduction of karate to the West. I think that was in the 60s. But certainly in the for me in the very early 70s, but is when I started. So hadn't had karate for very long in the West. That's for sure. But the interest, the obsession was with the notions of self-defense. Everything was these ancient kata are supposed to solve the problems of personal defense, one-on-one or one person against a number. And as we've already made clear, it's actually the reverse. It's actually a number of arresting people, 2 at least. Although the Naihanchin is really is an unfolding of one-on-one, why would you just be doing that if you've got a companion which you should have? I think I referred to it once quaintly in England as bobbies on bicycles from the song 2 by 2. And it is the case that you do get in England, you still get the single constables, but generally speaking, they're in pairs, for the reasons already stated. So the old, there is no old karate. There was only the kata. And then it was divided into styles based on the approaches, but the functions had been lost. The applications had been lost. Kata were accumulated and collected, and in some styles in a rather haphazard way. It needs to be understood that in the early stages of karate, and particularly with the advent of professional teachers, and no disrespect to professional teachers, I've been one myself, kata were at a premium, and they were, stock, shopkeeper's stock. And you can't take for granted that now if you want to see somebody else's kata, you just get onto YouTube and you can see any style you've heard of. You just go onto Google it, and up it will come. It's not that long ago, and some of us can remember you couldn't do that. We used to travel miles to go and see somebody's form, their kung fu, and that's if they would show it to us, and there'd usually be some kind of, you either had to be a student or there'd be some fees involved. I remember being, I don't know if this is a dubious claim to make, but one of the earliest people in, as far as I'm aware, certainly in England, but if not in Europe, to learn, I studied the Wing Chun Kung Fu style. And I one day answered an advertisement from to learn the third form, the BUG form. Wow. And I went and took private lessons to learn that's how it was. There wasn't a book with it in, or you couldn't, visit a website or something, or watch a YouTube video. There was no such. So to refer to Tom talking about the monkey fist, you couldn't see anything like that unless you saw it personally, or you could obtain film footage, the old-fashioned 8mm or whatever, and then later videos, of course. Now people can just look at anything, which really leads to the next bit, the next point, which is that internet and modern communications have led to an even greater proliferation of karate styles, as more and more individuals find recognizing the flaws and the difficulties in trying to make karate, antique kata, which are generally weapons kata in any case, without the weapons, conform or fit or work for one-on-one quote self-defense, or as Tom put it, could be applied in any kind of dueling, back and forth. So people, crikey, maybe some different kata or more kata. People could, take ideas from more sources than were available, certainly to the early founders of karate, and certainly to people my age and with my background and experience. We certainly couldn't see that stuff. The best I could do was having a friend that did Pak Mei and seeing the 9-step push form from an early age, but that was just luck on he happened to be being personally tutored by a former Hong Kong champion whose restaurant he worked in. But now, and I say there's a greater proliferation of forms because there's so much available on the internet. People can just, and so you've got new styles springing up. I can't say daily because I don't know, but on a regular basis, weekly, that would be safe. Globally, and people will get the kanji, the characters, the Chinese characters, or the Japanese characters, and try and find the characters for the name of the style that they've created. And just to defend our own position, gentlemen, not that needs defending, Kodo-ryu, which is our own approach, is not really a style as such. It's an approach as said earlier. It's the little diagram that tells you what's inside each of the chocolates. That's really thank you for that, Chania. That was such a good. That is really the significant difference between modern karate and its predecessor, which was basically just the forms. I'm not saying that I'm not excluding the existence of a ryuha. So the Weichi Ryu would be a good example, but it wasn't called Weichi Ryu. And in fact, that was named after the person who got it from China and took it from China to Japan, actually, and then ultimately back to Okinawa, where he came from. So the school was named after him, but it wasn't called and it was just the three kata again: Sanchin, Seisan, Sanseiru, and it wasn't really a style. It was a framework for using the sai for policing. But as I say, as more information has become available, then the number of quote styles has increased exponentially.
There's the ideas of the approach as well. You're looking at the modern martial arts in Japan, like judo and kendo, the two main dominant ones, were dueling, one to one person versus one person, and karate followed suit, and rightly so. I mean, why wouldn't have it gone that way? If the forms had arrived with the functions, there's no way you could have done that. You would have had to start with something else, which is what happened really with Funakoshi in many ways.
We're not saying that it's that it's wrong. Sorry I don't want to wear out the chocolate box analogy, but we're not saying that we don't believe that the orange chocolate shouldn't be in the box. So some people want that. It's just knowing what they are, and so we're not criticizing or pulling apart modern karate at all. And as you quite rightly put, that we're not. If the early founders had known what the kata actually did, it's likely or it's possible that we wouldn't even have had a modern karate. In which case, we wouldn't be even having this conversation. So we're not pulling it apart or at all. It was just, I think, context will be everything.
There's a really, what's going on with the European martial arts is fantastic. The historical martial arts collective, and that's the way it's viewed, where they're researching the European manuals that have survived from, medieval and Renaissance, all these different fencing manuals and military strategy manuals, and people are working out what they did and trying to create something from it. And no one's confusing the historical martial arts there, or the use of older types of weaponry, swords and spears and glaives and all that kind of stuff. No one's confused about what that is. People understand it. No one's going, well, that's not going to work in MMA. It was never. There's no confusion that that's what they were for. There's no one's kind of misinterpreting, going, well, that fencing manual from Germany in the 16th century, I don't see. That's where we are here with these antique forms. That's where they belong. They belong in that historical martial arts collective, looking at what's happened over the last few hundred years and how technology's changed the way everything's done and all the rest of it. I'm going to talk about that later. But presenting this research and presenting the original functions of these forms and the information and perspectives is to recategorize these forms in the sense of classical karate and modern karate can belong together as the greater karate, but the classical bit, the use of weapons, the use of tools, martial skills, which weren't categorized by style, they were categorized by the job. What's the job? To police, to bodyguard, whatever, belongs in that historical martial arts. And what's taken place in karate since then, the very, very highly developed skills of full contact and karate combat and things like that, is the modern evolution of it. And it's not a linear evolution. Bits got lost, so something else happened, and then something else happened. But we've now gone back and found a bit, and so it's kind of reordering and getting all of that. And our aim here is to get all of that information that we have out there for people to take and run with and do what they want with it.
I know we're winding down now. I'd just like to quickly say this, that the point made earlier about one set of police skills would be officers could be riding horses in a city, for instance, London in England, or they could be dog handling or driving a motorway car up and down, or an area car. there wouldn't be, although in police training, and this is one way of looking at it, you might get to see all of those things. Ultimately, you won't be doing all of those things. So there's no point in having there's no point in expecting to go to work and, well, I've got basic dog handling skills, and then I've got, I can ride a horse too, and I can drive the area car, or I can drive very fast because I've had the training. You won't do all of those things, and you might experience them in your basic training, but get a look at them, but you're not going to use a bit from one and a bit from another and a bit of dog handling and a bit. No, you're not. And I think that it's no different to the way it always was, and so that ties it together. And it ties together very much with function dictates the form, as we discussed previously. And we don't want a bit of dog handling with a bit of horse riding, with a bit of fast motorway driving. They don't all go together like that. They're very specific skills for very specific purposes.
I'll just throw in one last point. I'll keep it very, very brief. Just that these historical martial skills, these different contexts and these different forms, I think they really enrich karate, and I think they really enrich the history. I think it's got a lot to offer, and it's not, as Nathan said earlier, it's not criticizing what people have done or what they're doing. It's an attempt to, let's let karate combat, cut it free from the antique forms. Let those guys do what they do, what they're amazing at, and cut it free from MMA. That's what it is. MMA doesn't need any kata, and it doesn't belong there. But it does have its place, and it did have its place, and it was as functional as anything else which is at the fore today. Just doesn't, but it's not of our time. It's of another time, and it's not of our culture. It's of another culture. But it doesn't mean that we can't understand it and enjoy those practices and appreciate those skills. That we have access to them because we have the manuals, and the kata are the primary sources of karate history, not written records or reports or the books. It's the forms that are the primary sources, and we're really, really lucky to have them. Yeah, I'll end it there. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
And that's a wrap on today's episode of Great Karate Myths. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like, follow, or subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep the conversation going and the myths busting. We'd like to hear from our listeners. So if you have any myths you'd like us to explore or stories to share, don't hesitate to reach out. And if you're interested in booking a seminar or training in Kodo-ryu, get in touch with us through www.kodoryu.com. Stay inspired and see you on the next episode.